So, hello everyone. My talk's called Advancing the Bitcoin User Experience, Designing for Developers and End Users. And I know it's design. I've been working surrounded by developers for a while now. And I know that design can often be dismissed as something boring or even easy, but it's really not as simple as that. I mean, you can have a cryptography that is mathematically accurate and a software that doesn't have any perceivable bugs. But if your design is faulty in a way that the user doesn't understand, or even worse, misunderstands something about your interface, then all the work that you've done will be built upon a very fragile foundation. And that on a long enough timeline, it will be brought down by some clever exploit that uses that. So really, let's go and see a bit of design in Bitcoin. So my name is Patrícia Estevão. I'm a UX designer. My main contacts are here on my website, but I'm also on Twitter. You can find me. And as Tony said, I have a project called Bitcoin Design, which is also very cool if you want to share material for education in general about Bitcoin. So I want to begin with the statement that I think the main point of design when creating a Bitcoin software is to design for understanding. What do I mean by that? We are talking about decentralized digital money. It's not a game, it's not text messaging, and it's something that probably many people will still be struggling to understand the concept when they get your software. So it is more crucial than ever for you to create an interface that the user understands, that he understands what he's doing and what is happening. If he doesn't, then he's more likely to make mistakes, and in Bitcoin, mistakes can cost a lot. They can cost you a user, they can cost you money directly, and well, they cost you the development time that you took to build that. So I really think that investing both time and money in a design process can be a lot cheaper in the end for you. So I want to highlight two aspects of a design process for you, which are the application of design principles and the application of real and relevant information about your user, which means creating a user-centered design. We'll start with the design principles, which design principles are basically the universal guidelines for creating a good design. I mean, to break a common misconception, design decisions shouldn't be completely subjective to an artistic mind. There are some pretty objective choices to be made based on these principles. And so to illustrate them a little bit, I'll be showing just a few examples of design principles, first explaining their basic concept and then translating them into how they would apply to a Bitcoin interface. So I'll be using wireframes of a Bitcoin wallet for that. And note that I won't be showing any revolutionary interface. Most of the elements that I use here are already in use by one or more wallets. The idea is that I'll be showing you the interface and the why of some of these design decisions. So in a way that you can later replicate these decisions in a more knowledgeable manner in your own situations, in your own specific projects. So let's start. First, there is the principle of the signifier, which is any perceivable cue or indicator that communicates to the user how they should behave. So, for example, if we see this rectangle with a colored background and a text inside, our interface conventions tell us what to do. They tell us that it is a button. So by seeing this type of style, we know that it's supposed to be clicked. So we say that this signifies a button. And although there are lots of buttons in the Bitcoin interface, I'd like to show a different example of a signifier here. This is an example of a page to set up a PIN to protect the wallet. And can you imagine, like, where is a signifier here, what is indicating something to the user. So these little circles are signifiers. They indicate to the user in advance how many digits their PIN should have, which is very handy so the person can plan their PIN ahead instead of putting numbers nonstop until the interface blocks them, or even worse, having an interface that doesn't constrain the number of digits and just returns an error until you get the right length, which is awful, but it happens sometimes in web services that don't tell you how many digits your password should have. So next we have constraint. Constraint is a limitation of the possible actions you have in a way that it guides you into knowing what to do. For example, these ports of a computer, they have a constraint in their shapes and their sizes. So you won't be able to connect a cable with a shape different from this port. So it guides you into knowing which cable should go where. In a Bitcoin wallet, an example of a constraint can be seen here. This is a structure of a page to send a transaction. And you'd like to make sure that your user will complete it with all the necessary information before sending it, that he doesn't forget the amount or the address. So you can create the following constraint. You keep the send button disabled as long as there is important information missing. That way, the user will know that he still can send a transaction, and that's more likely than not because he needs to fill in more of the fields. And of course, you should communicate this disabled state somehow. So here we use a signifier of this constraint, which is the lighter background color in the disabled state. And now feedback and warning. Feedback means communicating the results of an action. If we see a lighted button like this one, it is a feedback saying that the system acknowledges your action of pressing the button. While warnings are, of course, a way to warn the user about some action that he's taking. And these yellow triangular signs are common signs of a warning about some kind of danger in the place that a person is in. In a Bitcoin wallet, an example of a good use of feedback is to tell that user that he completed an action successfully, such as sending a transaction. While the warning can be used to prevent unnoticed mistakes, such as sending a very high transaction fee. Since the Bitcoin protocol cannot be very forgiving of mistakes, there isn't much space for undoing things, then these two principles are very, very important when it comes to preventing the mistakes and reassuring the user after an important operation has been made. Just note that warnings can be kind of tricky because if you overuse them and there's a pop-up every 2 screens interrupting the flow of the task, then users will start to automatically ignore them, like it happens in some operational systems. But we certainly don't want this to happen in our Bitcoin interface. So use warnings sparingly. Leave warnings for when you don't have any other option, like you can't communicate something with the constraint or with the signifier, then use the warning. Visual hierarchy, alignments, and separation. These principles all concern the spatial organization of content. And although they might not seem very related to security issues at first, they are quite important to that idea that I said about design for understanding. And that's because, we can all read a newspaper like this, even though it's cramped with information. And that's because they use visual hierarchy to highlight the titles, effectively indicating where each section starts. They also use alignment so we know how to follow the text properly. And they use separators to separate each section in a non-ambiguous way. So these principles can be applied to a very crucial part of the Bitcoin interface, which is the backup through the mnemonic seed. This is an operation that is new to many users, and they probably didn't do anything like that in any other systems they used. It's something new, something different. So it's really important to reduce all the doubts they might have here, to make it very non-ambiguous. So let's see. Here we can compare and see like the objective superiority of an interface that applies those principles. How is that? Both of them have the exact same text content, but the interface on the right presents the mnemonic codes first with a higher importance in the visual hierarchy, since it is the most important content of the page. It separates and aligns each word to make it easier to read them separately. And finally, it uses a non-ambiguous signifier of their order, which is the number that is grouped with each word. That way the user really is sure about the order of the words. And all that makes it a lot easier to understand this important part of the wallet's backup. So as our last principles before we move on, we'll see secure defaults and customization. Secure defaults concern the idea that your user should be as safe as possible if they start to use your product exactly the way they got it, without changing a thing. While customization, as the name suggests, is to give the user some degree of control over the product to better customize it to his needs. If we get a home appliance like a toaster, for example, it might be silly, but we hope that its default state is turned off. Otherwise, as soon as we plug it to a power outlet, it will start working and we will burn our stuff and might even get hurt. At the same time, it's important to have some amount of control over the type of heating and the amount of heating so that we can suit it to multiple needs. So for the Bitcoin wallet, we'll take a look at this theoretical settings page. As I said, it's important to give the user some amount of control over his environment so that he can feel more comfortable while operating the wallet. The US dollar, for example, is usually the default currency for the fiat currency on most wallets. And that seems like a reasonable choice. But if I'm using this wallet for daily transactions of goods and services, it can be much more convenient to have it set to my local currency. And when I say convenient, I mean that it will reduce my cognitive load of manually converting the values by myself, and therefore it will reduce my chances of making a mistake and setting wrong transaction amounts. And that's the same logic for every other aspect that you believe will be useful for the user to customize. At the same time, we do have to think that many users, particularly novice users, never visit their settings page, especially when it's buried in a multi-level menu. So there are two considerations that I like to make about this. First, if you believe it is useful for the user to access their settings page, then make it more accessible. This example shows the settings page here on the main navigation, which is not always possible for every interface, but you'll get the idea. And the second thing is that this is the perfect time to put in practice the secure defaults. Imagine for a moment that your user will never enter the settings page. How safe is the wallet for them? Do you think they are more protected if they set up a PIN? Then make the PIN enabled as a default by adding it to the wallet setup process. Do you think that they should set a maximum fee so that they accidentally don't send a $50 fee? Then serve the wallet already with a reasonable default that they can change later if they like. Finally, I'd like to make a comment about how designing for security makes a lot more sense when you understand your user's threat model. This CBackup option has been pointed out to me on a previous occasion as an insecure design choice. And I thought about it for a while. I still believe that for many threat models, not all of course, the the added risk of having this option here is not enough to counterbalance the benefits of having an easy way to redo and to check your backup. But that's not really my choice. That's a decision that belongs to the development team of any wallet. The point that I want to make is that if you understand your user threat model properly, you will be able to give the proper weight to this kind of decision, where you have the ease of use on one side and the security constraint on the other. So we covered a few design principles, and I now would like to make a comment about the user-centered part of design that I mentioned before. What I mean is that you should base your decisions on real and relevant information about your users. Design decisions are subjective, but as I said before, not to your creativity exactly. They are subjective to the user you want to serve and to the problem that you are trying to solve. So here's where we have to mention user research, user testing, and a constant work of improvement based on the information that you are getting from real users. And I know that user research can sound a bit scary because when we read about those processes, we usually see things like a perfect setup where a company brings people in and they are put in a special room where they are filmed and recorded while doing a task. And it all sounds very scientific and very expensive, which it can be. But I mean, if your company can do all that, that's wonderful. But if you're building a startup and with two other friends working from home, having meetings at a coffee place, then you might not be able to afford this perfect setup. But I think that really shouldn't be an excuse for you to ignore design altogether. There are, for example, nowadays, a variety of web services that offer a low-cost version of user research and testing. They have different options and different prices, like surveys and remote testing, and they are all much more affordable than having your own infrastructure for it. So we have covered until now what is probably the most obvious part of the importance of UX in Bitcoin, which is the interface that the user sees. But we do have to think, who builds these interfaces? Programmers, of course. And programmers are also users. They are users of their editors, of a programming language, of an API, of any tool they use in the development process. And therefore, as users, they are also likely to make mistakes, and in this case, to introduce bugs in the program if they have a bad usability on the tools they rely on. So the difference is that a programmer's mistake can potentially harm a lot more people, since the software they are building will ultimately serve the end users. So that's why programmer UX is also a very important part of the UX in Bitcoin. And if you're looking for inspiration on what to work in Bitcoin, figuring out solutions for programmer UX is also a really cool way to go. A very simple example of a lack of UX by programmer and for programmers is poorly documented code, or even poorly written, in the sense that it's unnecessarily difficult for a human being to understand it. That's why I really like these quotes. Programs are meant to be read by humans and only incidentally for computers to execute. It really highlights this importance of writing clear and understandable code, because when we have a security-critical software like Bitcoin, the last thing we should want is having a code base where the programmers are completely lost in. That is a security nightmare. So as for examples of programmer UX more focused in Bitcoin, if you have already worked with the Bitcoin script language, you might have noticed that it is pretty limited in expressiveness, let's say. And it is like that by design. It's a trade-off that you make when you have a language built for a blockchain that wants to prioritize reliability. So it's great that it is like that for the regular operations and transactions. It's actually good UX. So here we can see, for example, one of the most common types of transactions we have in the Bitcoin, using Bitcoin script language. And this is basically one of the most simple examples you can get of Bitcoin script if you are doing something more than an op return. And it works, it's good. But when the need comes to more complex smart contracts, then the usability of the Bitcoin script can deteriorate pretty fast. Programs can get very convoluted, very difficult to work with, and that really facilitates the introduction of bugs. So that's why there are projects thinking about how to facilitate this process, this writing of complex smart contracts in Bitcoin for programmers. And I'm just mentioning the two that I know of, which are the languages Ivy, created by Chain, and Simplicity, created by Blockstream. Both of them target this difficulty of creating complex smart contracts. They do it with kind of different approaches, but they are really worth checking it out. And since it's very important to minimize the bugs in a Bitcoin software, it is also very important to have a tool to help developers to find them. So BTC-Deb is a set of tools used to debug and to help constructing scripts in Bitcoin. So yes, a debugger is an important tool for programmer UX as well, since it prevents many errors. And hopefully I was able to make you see a bit more how design applies to different aspects of a Bitcoin project, and how it is important not only if we want a pretty interface, but also if our #1 priority is security. So my final thoughts about how you can introduce a design process in your project is both. The most straightforward option, of course, is hiring a designer, even though I recommend that every programmer gets involved in the design process. Having a designer really helps. But since that's not always an option, if you're a startup, if you're in the beginning of your project, I really recommend you study some design by yourselves. I mean, it might sound a bit crazy, but you can do a Pareto study and focus on the basics that will give you the most results. Find some guidelines, some recommendations from a good source, and apply them the best you can. A little design in Bitcoin can be better than no design at all. It can really make your users happier, and it will give your software the appreciation that it deserves. So thank you, special thanks to Mark Wagner, who is here, hiding himself, who helped me with the developer's perspective in all this. And that's what I had for you today. Thank you. So, I'll do it.
Thanks, guys. Any questions? Yep.
As someone who's used like learning apps, things like Duolingo and other stuff like that, that kind of gamify learning, do you have any plans in the stuff that you're doing to kind of put little bits of education into wallets, so that as people are using wallets and maybe they take a bit longer to do some processes, that you can explain maybe in videos or quizzes why people are doing stuff, so that we're actually educating people about the principles of Bitcoin, because the biggest problem is the conceptual shift that people have from centralized to decentralized.
But just let me understand. You were asking if I think it's worth it, or what?
Just about how you might.
Okay.
How you might go about the process, or what you see the future or possibilities of that in wallets.
So I really like the idea of educating users about the basic concepts. That's why I also have a project with the graphics that are explanatory concepts of Bitcoin. But I think there will be a limit in that not everyone will be very interested in going through the basic concepts just to use Bitcoin. So I believe there is a big part of that should be in the interface. applying everything that I said about design principles, thinking about how you can build the interface in a way that it explains itself. But yes, I think that will be some point that users will have to learn, and in a way that the technology will also shape the users. So I think that I like the idea of having, for example, those quick presentations when you first get to an app. I think that's nice if you don't overdo it. In general, I can't really say a lot about what's going to happen because we really need to get users' feedback to understand what is going to happen. But I think that at some point, people will have to learn something about an interface that is specific to Bitcoin. Like they learned something specific to another app that they used. Like they learned that swiping things to one side does something. So I think we'll have an interface that talks to users, but the user will also be shaped by the interface at some point.
All right, anything else? One more.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but like, are there any particular Bitcoin wallets or say the Casa software or Lightning wallets that you think the design is really good or really bad? And perhaps in future presentations, you could actually highlight examples in Bitcoin wallets of what you like and what you don't like.
So yeah, I have been kind of not very updated on how things are right now, but from what I've been seeing like from past months, one of the wallets that I usually like the most was Samurai Wallet, but that's just kind of a personal preference. I mean, because they are going the length to do the security and privacy things, but they are also working on how to make it easier for the user. So I appreciate that. But it's not like I can say that there are other wallets that aren't doing the same. I've been kind of not very updated in that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.